But before we tell you what happened, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of the incredible revenge stories we share here. When I first met Marco Benedetti at the Italian Heritage Foundation Gala in San Francisco, I knew I was walking into dangerous territory. Not because of him. Marco was everything I had ever dreamed of in a partner, with his warm laugh and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. The danger came from what I would have to hide, what I would have to carefully portion out like medicine to avoid poisoning what we were building together. I had told him my family was successful in Italy, that we owned vineyards and had shipping interests. But I had been deliberately vague about the scope of our influence. How do you casually mention that your family's name appears on buildings across 3 continents? How do you explain that when you were 16, you attended a dinner party where 3 heads of state were guests? Marco knew Valentina Rossi came from money, but he had no idea that the woman who stole his heart was heir to an empire that could trace its roots back to Renaissance merchant princes. That carefully constructed half-truth had seemed like wisdom 6 months ago. But now, 3 days before our wedding, it felt like a time bomb waiting to explode. The deception had started as self-preservation, born from too many relationships where men fell in love with my portfolio instead of my personality. I had watched my cousins struggle with the gold digger phenomenon, never knowing if their partners truly loved them or just saw them as lottery tickets to a lifestyle beyond imagination. So when Marco introduced himself as just a local contractor who loves old buildings, I had made a split-second decision to downplay my heritage. I told him we were comfortable, successful, but not the whole truth about what the Rossi name represented in certain circles. He knew about our vineyards in Tuscany, but not that they produced some of the most exclusive wines in the world. He knew about our shipping business, but not that Rossi Maritime International employed over 50,000 people across 4 continents. The man I was going to marry in 3 days thought he was getting a well-to-do Italian-American bride, not someone whose family could buy and sell his entire neighborhood without blinking. That gap between perception and reality was about to become a chasm, and I wasn't sure our relationship could survive the earthquake that was coming. Marco's mother, Benedetta, had been my biggest challenge from day one, but not for the reasons I had initially expected. She wasn't threatened by my money. She was threatened by what she perceived as my lack of proper Italian breeding. In her mind, I was American money trying to buy Italian class, a nouveau riche pretender who had somehow seduced her son with flashy wealth rather than genuine substance. The irony was breathtaking. Here was this woman, whose own family had arrived in America with nothing but hope and determination, looking down on me for supposedly lacking the very heritage that my family had been preserving for centuries. She spoke to me in rapid Italian during family dinners, testing my fluency, criticizing my accent as too proper for someone who had supposedly grown up in California. What she didn't realize was that my Italian was too proper because I had learned it from tutors in actual palazzos, from professors who taught at centuries-old universities, from countesses who could trace their lineage back to the Medici court. Every time she corrected my pronunciation or explained some authentic Italian tradition, I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at the absurdity of it all. The wedding planning had become a psychological warfare campaign, with Benedetta undermining every decision while maintaining a facade of helpfulness. She criticized our choice of venue, Auberge du Soleil in Napa Valley, as too American, not traditional enough for a real Italian wedding. She questioned our menu selections, our flower arrangements, even our choice of music, all while smiling sweetly and claiming she just wanted what's best for Marco. What she really wanted was to establish her dominance, to make it clear that I might have money but she had culture, tradition, and most importantly, her son's unconditional love. The constant needling was exhausting, but I endured it because Marco was worth it, because our love was strong enough to survive his mother's disapproval. At least, that's what I told myself during the long nights when I lay awake wondering if I should have been more honest from the beginning. The truth about my family was going to come out eventually. It always did. The question was whether it would emerge gradually, as a pleasant surprise, or explosively, as a revelation that could destroy everything we had built together. As I stared at my grandmother's wedding dress hanging in the closet, the same gown that had graced 3 generations of Rossi brides, I had the sinking feeling that the choice was no longer mine to make. The Italian language had become our secret battlefield, with Benedetta wielding it like a weapon whenever she wanted to exclude me from conversations or express her true feelings without consequences. What she didn't know was that I understood every word, every inflection, every subtle insult wrapped in maternal concern. During our engagement party at Marco's family restaurant in North Beach, she had stood at the bar with her sister Maria, speaking in what she assumed was a safe linguistic cocoon. "This girl thinks she can buy her way into our family," she had whispered in rapid Sicilian dialect, apparently forgetting that my mother's family originated from the same region. She has money but no soul, no understanding of what it means to be truly Italian. Marco deserves better than this American imposter. The words had hit me like physical blows, but I had maintained my composure, continuing to smile and nod as if I hadn't understood the character assassination happening 3 feet away from me. Each insult was catalogued, stored away for future reference, building a case for a trial that Benedetta didn't even know she was facing. The patience required for this masquerade was enormous, but it came naturally to someone raised in a family where strategic thinking was as essential as breathing. The final straw had come just 2 weeks before the wedding, during what was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday dinner at the Benedetti family home. Marco had been called away to handle a work emergency, leaving me alone with his parents for the first time since our engagement. Giuseppe, his father, had dozed off in front of the television, leaving Benedetta and me to clean up after the meal. I had been washing dishes, trying to make conversation about the upcoming ceremony, when she began speaking in Italian to Maria over the phone. The conversation started innocuously enough, complaints about the heat, gossip about neighbors, but quickly escalated into something much darker. "I'm going to make sure she knows her place at this wedding," Benedetta had said, her voice carrying clearly across the small kitchen. "Rich or not, she needs to understand that she's marrying into a real Italian family, not buying her way into one. By the time I'm finished with her, she'll know exactly what I think of American girls who think money makes them special." The venom in her voice was unmistakable, and I realized that she wasn't just disapproving of me. She was actively planning some kind of public humiliation for our wedding day. The dish I was washing slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, shattering against the bottom of the sink like my illusions about peaceful coexistence. That night, lying next to Marco as he slept peacefully, I made a decision that would change everything. If Benedetta wanted to play games at our wedding, if she was planning to use our most sacred day as a platform for her prejudices, then she was going to learn exactly who she was dealing with. I reached for my phone and sent a series of carefully worded messages to family members across 2 continents. It was time to let the Rossi family know that one of their own was under attack, and it was time to remind certain people why our name had commanded respect for over 3 centuries. The responses came back quickly, confirmations of travel plans, expressions of outrage at what I had endured, and promises that justice would be swift and memorable. My cousin Lorenzo would arrive from Rome with documents that could crush any business dreams the Benedetti family might harbor. My uncle Alessandro would bring wines that cost more per bottle than most people made in a month, a not-so-subtle reminder of the difference between real Italian nobility and its American echoes. By dawn, I had assembled an army of witnesses and allies, all of whom understood that this was about more than one woman's petty jealousy. This was about protecting the family honor, and the Rossi family had never backed down from that responsibility. Benedetta thought she was fighting a spoiled American princess, but she was about to discover that she had declared war on Italian royalty, and that was a mistake from which there would be no recovery. The 3 days leading up to our wedding felt like living in the eye of a hurricane, knowing that the calm was temporary and that devastation was approaching from all sides. Marco sensed my tension but attributed it to normal pre-wedding jitters, showering me with extra affection and reassurance that only made my guilt heavier. How do you tell the man you love that you've been lying by omission for 6 months? How do you explain that his mother's cruelty has forced you to orchestrate what might be the most spectacular family revelation in Northern California history? Every time he squeezed my hand and told me how excited he was for me to meet his real family from Italy, my stomach twisted with the knowledge of what was really coming. I had family arriving from Europe, but not the modest, successful relatives he was expecting. The guest list had quietly expanded to include some of the most powerful names in Italian society. People whose presence alone would shift the social dynamics of our reception like a seismic event. My phone buzzed constantly with updates from Lorenzo's assistant about travel arrangements, security details, and the careful choreography required to manage what was essentially a state visit disguised as a family wedding. Each message felt like another secret I was keeping from Marco. Another layer of deception that might ultimately destroy the trust we had built together. Benedetta, meanwhile, had entered what I could only describe as a victory lap mentality, convinced that she had successfully intimidated me into submission. At our final wedding planning meeting with the catering staff, she took over the conversation entirely, making last-minute changes to seating arrangements and menu selections as if she were the bride instead of the mother of the groom. "Family traditions are so important," she announced loudly, making sure everyone in the room could hear her cultural superiority. "Some people think that money can replace heritage, but real Italians know better." The comment was clearly directed at me, accompanied by a pointed look that left no doubt about her meaning. The catering manager shifted uncomfortably, obviously sensing the tension but unsure how to navigate the family dynamics playing out in front of him. I smiled serenely and nodded agreement, playing my role as the accommodating daughter-in-law while mentally adding another charge to the indictment I was building against her. Every insult was evidence. Every slight was proof of what Marco needed to see about his mother's true character. The patience required for this performance was excruciating. But I reminded myself that the best revenge is always served at exactly the right temperature. And mine was going to be ice cold. Marco's bachelor party had provided a brief respite from the family tension, but it also gave me time alone with my thoughts that I wasn't sure I wanted. As I soaked in the bathtub of our hotel suite, I found myself questioning everything about the path I had chosen. Was I being vindictive, or was I protecting my marriage? Was this elaborate revelation necessary, or was I just tired of being underestimated and disrespected? The questions churned in my mind like storm clouds, but every time I considered backing down, I remembered Benedetta's voice on the phone, planning my public humiliation with the casual cruelty of someone who thought herself untouchable. She had made this personal, had turned our wedding into a battleground, and I refused to start my marriage from a position of defeat. The Rossi family had not survived centuries of political upheaval, economic uncertainty, and social transformation by avoiding difficult confrontations. We survived by facing them head-on, with intelligence, precision, and overwhelming force when necessary. Tomorrow was going to be necessary, and I was ready to honor that legacy. My great-grandmother had rebuilt our fortune from the ashes of World War II. I could certainly handle one bitter mother-in-law with delusions of grandeur. The morning of the wedding brought an unexpected complication that nearly derailed my carefully laid plans. Marco appeared at my bridal suite door at sunrise, his face pale with anxiety, and his hands shaking as he struggled to find the right words. "Val, we need to talk," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made my blood run cold. "My mother. She said some things last night at dinner that I can't ignore anymore. About you, about your family, about our marriage." For a terrifying moment, I thought Benedetta had somehow discovered my plans and convinced Marco to call off the wedding entirely. But as he continued talking, I realized the truth was both better and worse than I had feared. Better because Marco was finally seeing his mother's behavior clearly. Worse because he was questioning everything about our relationship in the process. "She keeps talking about how you're not, really, Italian. How you're trying to buy your way into our family with money instead of earning your place with respect and tradition. I've been defending you, but the things she says, They're getting more cruel, more personal. I need to know. Is there something about your family that you haven't told me? Because if there is, I'd rather hear it from you than discover it some other way. The irony was overwhelming. Here was my chance to come clean, to avoid the public revelation I had orchestrated. But it was too late to change course now. My family was already en route, the pieces were in motion, and the truth was going to come out whether I controlled it or not. I took Marco's hands in mine and made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. There are things about my family that I haven't shared with you, I admitted, watching his face carefully for any sign of how he was processing this confirmation of his fears. Not because I wanted to deceive you, but because I needed to know that you loved me for who I am, not what I represent. My family, we're more prominent in Italy than I let on, more influential, more established. The words felt inadequate, like trying to describe an ocean by calling it wet. But they were all I could manage without revealing everything. Marco's expression cycled through relief, confusion, and something that looked dangerously like hurt. So, my mother was right. You have been hiding things from me. The accusation in his voice was gentle but unmistakable, and I felt something crack inside my chest. This was exactly what I had been trying to avoid, the moment when honesty looked like betrayal, when protection felt like deception. I was going to tell you everything during our honeymoon, I said, hearing how weak that sounded even as the words left my mouth. But I just wanted to get through the wedding first, to start our marriage without complications. Marco studied my face for a long moment, and I could see him struggling between his love for me and his growing realization that the woman he was marrying still had secrets he couldn't fathom. What exactly does more prominent mean, Val? Because I feel like I'm about to marry someone I don't really know. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door that saved me from having to answer immediately. My cousin Lorenzo stood in the hallway, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, his presence radiating the quiet confidence that came with inherited power. "A cugina," he said warmly, embracing me with familiar affection before turning to Marco with polite interest. "You must be the groom, Lorenzo Rossi, Valentina's cousin from Rome. We've all been so excited to meet the man who captured our little princess's heart." The introduction was casual, almost dismissive, but I could see Marco's mind working as he processed the name and the implications. Rossi Maritime International had offices in San Francisco. Their logo was visible on shipping containers throughout the Bay Area. The connection was obvious once you knew to look for it, but Marco had never had reason to make that leap before now. His eyes moved between Lorenzo and me, and I watched understanding dawn like sunrise breaking over his face. "Princess," he repeated slowly, testing the word as if it might explode in his mouth. Lorenzo's smile was benign but telling, the expression of someone who had just realized he might have said too much. "Just a family nickname," he assured Marco, but the damage was done. My fiancé was looking at me like he was seeing a stranger, and in many ways, he was. The woman he thought he knew was about to be revealed as something entirely different, and I wasn't sure our love was strong enough to survive that transformation. As Lorenzo discreetly withdrew to give us privacy, Marco sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands as he tried to process what was happening. "How much haven't you told me, Val? Because I'm starting to feel like everything I thought I knew about you might be a lie." The pain in his voice was genuine and devastating, confirming my worst fears about how this revelation would affect our relationship. I knelt beside him, desperate to bridge the growing gap between us before it became uncrossable. "My love for you isn't a lie," I said firmly, forcing him to meet my eyes. "My desire to build a life with you isn't a lie. The only thing I haven't been completely honest about is the scope of my family's success, and I hid that because I needed to know that you wanted me, not what I could give you." Marco searched my face as if looking for traces of the woman he had fallen in love with, and I could see him struggling to reconcile the person he knew with the implications of what he was learning. What kind of success are we talking about here? Because Lorenzo didn't look like the cousin of someone who just owns a few vineyards. The question hung between us like a bridge that could either connect us or collapse entirely, taking our relationship with it. In a few hours, he would have his answer whether I gave it to him now or not. The only question was whether I would control the narrative or let events speak for themselves. Looking into his confused, hurt eyes, I made the choice that felt like the right one in the moment, even though I would spend the rest of my life wondering if it was actually the worst decision I could have made. "You'll understand everything tonight," I whispered, kissing his forehead like a benediction. "I promise you, after tonight, there will be no more secrets between us." It was the truth, but not the comfort either of us needed in that moment. The hours between that devastating conversation with Marco and the ceremony felt like living in suspended animation. Every moment stretched taut with anticipation and dread. I moved through the motions of bridal preparation, hair, makeup, photography, while my mind raced through all the ways this day could go catastrophically wrong. My phone buzzed with updates from the concierge about VIP arrivals, each notification marking another piece of my carefully constructed secret falling into place. The governor of Tuscany had landed at SFO with his security detail. The CEO of Fiat had checked into the St. Helena resort. My godmother, whose husband's family owned half of Rome, was currently being driven up Highway 29 in a motorcade that required coordination with local police. These weren't just wealthy relatives attending a wedding. They were power brokers whose presence would fundamentally alter the social landscape of Napa Valley for the next 24 hours. The local event coordinators were having nervous breakdowns trying to accommodate security requirements they hadn't been warned about, while I watched my careful plans spiral into something much larger and more complicated than I had originally intended. The line between justice and overkill was blurring, and I was no longer sure which side of it I was on. My mother arrived at noon like a visiting head of state, which, in certain circles, she essentially was. Caterina Rossi commanded attention without demanding it, her presence filling the bridal suite with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone stand a little straighter. She took one look at my face and knew immediately that something had gone wrong. "Cosa è successo?" she asked in rapid Italian, and I found myself pouring out the entire story. Marco's questions, his hurt, my growing fear that I had destroyed our relationship before it even began. My mother listened without interruption, her expression cycling through understanding, sympathy, and finally, the cold calculation that had made her one of the most feared negotiators in European business. "Hai fatto quello che dovevi fare," she said firmly when I finished. "You did what you had to do. That woman forced your hand with her cruelty. Now we finish what she started, and your husband learns who he really married." The certainty in her voice was comforting, but I could see the worry in her eyes. My mother understood better than anyone the delicate balance between protection and deception, between family loyalty and personal happiness. She had walked this same tightrope when she married my father, navigating the complexities of joining two powerful dynasties without losing herself in the process. Her advice carried the weight of experience, but also the knowledge that some choices, once made, could never be undone. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion and barely controlled chaos. Marco looked devastatingly handsome in his custom tuxedo, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the questions still swirling behind his eyes. He smiled for the cameras and said his vows with conviction, but there was a guardedness that hadn't been there before, a distance that felt like a physical barrier between us. When we kissed as husband and wife, it should have been the happiest moment of my life, but instead, it felt like a question mark, the beginning of something uncertain rather than the celebration of something secure. The guests erupted in applause, rose petals filled the air, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything would be fine, that love would conquer all the complications I had created. But as we walked back down the aisle together, I caught sight of Benedetta's face in the crowd. Her expression was triumphant, satisfied, as if she had won some victory I wasn't yet aware of. The look sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October breeze, and I realized that whatever she had planned for the reception was going to be worse than anything I had imagined. The war between us was far from over. If anything, the real battle was just beginning, and I was no longer certain who held the advantage. The cocktail hour revealed the true scope of what I had unleashed. The vineyard buzzed with conversations in multiple languages as European nobility mingled with Napa Valley society, creating a social dynamic that was both fascinating and terrifying to observe. Local wine industry leaders found themselves chatting with people who owned centuries-old estates that made their businesses look like lemonade stands. Society photographers worked overtime to capture images of guests whose presence would be front-page news in Italian publications by morning. The Benedetti family looked increasingly overwhelmed as they realized the caliber of people surrounding them, their earlier confidence evaporating as they grasped that this was no ordinary Italian-American wedding. Giuseppe kept asking Marco where all these important-looking people had come from, while Benedetta's friends from North Beach huddled together like refugees from their own social inadequacy. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Old-world elegance versus new-world aspiration, inherited grace versus acquired pretension. I watched it all unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and growing dread, knowing that I had created this spectacle but no longer certain I could control its consequences. The stage was set for a revelation that would be remembered for decades, but I was beginning to understand that some performances leave everyone changed, including the person who writes the script. Marco moved through the reception like a man in a daze, shaking hands with guests whose names meant nothing to him, but whose importance was becoming increasingly apparent. I watched him try to process the evidence accumulating around him, the security details, the diplomatic license plates, the casual references to palaces and parliaments that peppered conversations like seasoning. His confusion was painful to witness, especially knowing that I was the architect of his bewilderment. When my uncle Alessandro presented us with a wedding gift, a vineyard in Tuscany that had been in our family for 4 centuries, Marco's face went completely blank. The property was worth more than his family's restaurant, their house, and probably their entire net worth combined, and it was being given away like a trinket. "This is too much," he whispered to me, his voice strained with embarrassment. "I can't accept this. We can't accept this." But Alessandro waved away his protests with the casual generosity of someone for whom money was merely a tool rather than a goal. "Family is family," he said simply, not understanding how those words were tearing my husband apart. Marco had grown up believing that marriage was a partnership between equals, and suddenly he was discovering that his wife came from a world where his entire life's achievements would barely register as a rounding error. The gift, meant as a gesture of acceptance and love, felt to him like charity, and I could see our relationship cracking under the weight of this unexpected imbalance. The breaking point came when Benedetta finally encountered my godmother at the bar. Sofia di Montecroce was the kind of woman who appeared on the society pages of international magazines, whose charity galas were attended by actual royalty, whose opinion could make or break reputations across Europe. She was also one of the kindest, most genuine people I had ever known, which made what happened next even more devastating. Benedetta, fortified by several glasses of Prosecco and emboldened by what she perceived as her territory, approached Sofia with the confidence of someone who had no idea how outclassed she was. "I don't believe we've met," she announced in heavily accented English, extending her hand with regal authority. "I'm Benedetta Benedetti, mother of the groom and hostess of this celebration." The presumption in that last phrase made several nearby guests exchange glances, but Sofia handled it with characteristic grace. "How lovely to meet you," she replied warmly. "I'm Sofia di Montecroce, Valentina's godmother. What a beautiful wedding you've helped create." It should have been a pleasant exchange between family members, but Benedetta's response revealed the depth of her misunderstanding about who she was dealing with. "Yes, well, "We Italians know how to celebrate properly," she said with pointed emphasis. "Not like these Americans who think money can buy tradition." The insult hung in the air like poison gas, and I watched Sophia's expression shift from warmth to careful neutrality. She had just been insulted by someone who didn't understand that her own family's traditions stretched back to the Roman Empire. Someone who had no idea that she was speaking to a woman whose ancestors had been entertaining popes when the New World was still a rumor. The moment crystallized everything that was wrong with this entire situation. Here was Benedetta, so consumed with establishing her superiority over what she perceived as American pretension that she was insulting genuine Italian nobility to their faces. The irony was excruciating. She was acting exactly like the kind of nouveau riche poseur she accused me of being, desperately trying to prove her authenticity to people who represented the real thing. But more than that, I realized that this confrontation was exactly what she had been building toward all evening. This wasn't random social awkwardness. This was her planned assault on my family's legitimacy, her attempt to expose us as frauds in front of everyone who mattered. She thought she was calling our bluff, but she had no idea that she was about to discover just how real our credentials actually were. The time for subtlety had passed. The moment for strategic patience was over. Benedetta had just declared war on the wrong family at the wrong time, and she was about to learn why the Rossi name had survived and thrived for centuries. As I excused myself from my conversation with the governor's wife and moved toward the developing confrontation, I felt the familiar cold calm that had been passed down through generations of Rossi women facing down their enemies. The gloves were coming off, and Benedetta was about to discover what happened when you confused mercy for weakness, patience for powerlessness. The reckoning she had been so eager to provoke was finally at hand, and it was going to be everything she deserved and nothing she expected. The dinner reception began with all the ceremony and grandeur that $200,000 could buy. But underneath the surface elegance, I could feel the tension building like pressure in a champagne bottle. Marco and I sat at the head table, his hand finding mine occasionally, but without the unconscious ease that had always characterized our physical connection. The questions in his eyes had evolved from confusion to something approaching betrayal, and every time a server addressed me with unusual deference or a guest spoke to him about my impressive family legacy, I watched him retreat further into himself. The irony was devastating. I had orchestrated this entire evening to protect our marriage from his mother's toxicity, but in doing so, I might have poisoned it myself with secrets and half-truths. Benedetta, meanwhile, held court at the family table like a queen preparing for battle, her smile never wavering as she waited for what she clearly believed would be her moment of triumph. She had spent the cocktail hour circulating among my European guests, no doubt gathering intelligence for whatever public humiliation she had planned. What she didn't realize was that every conversation had only confirmed what I had been trying to tell Marco for months. That his mother was not the cultured Italian matriarch she pretended to be, but a bitter woman whose prejudices ran deeper than her loyalty to her own son. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the rest of our lives, and I was no longer certain who would be left standing when the dust settled. The first course arrived with military precision, but I could barely taste the delicate burrata as I watched Benedetta's performance unfold. She made pointed comments about proper Italian traditions, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, each observation designed to highlight what she perceived as my family's inadequacy. "Real Italian families understand the importance of humility," she announced to her sister Maria, her voice carrying just enough to reach the ears of my cousin Lorenzo. "All this display, all this showing off, it's very American, very nouveau riche." The comments would have been merely embarrassing if directed at ordinary wealthy Americans, but the Europeans at surrounding tables were beginning to exchange glances that spoke volumes. My godmother Sophia maintained her serene composure, but I could see the slight tightening around her eyes that signaled her growing displeasure. These weren't people accustomed to being lectured about authenticity by someone whose own credentials were questionable at best. But what made the situation truly explosive was that Benedetta was building towards something bigger, using these preliminary insults as ammunition for whatever devastating revelation she thought she possessed. I had seen this pattern before in business negotiations, the systematic undermining of an opponent's credibility before delivering a knockout blow. The difference was that this wasn't a boardroom, this was my wedding, and the collateral damage would include everyone I loved most in the world. Marco's growing agitation was becoming impossible to ignore. Every time his mother made another pointed comment about authentic Italian values or proper family traditions, I felt him tense beside me like a coiled spring. He had begun to piece together the evidence accumulating around him, the security details, the diplomatic protocols, the casual references to properties and businesses that suggested wealth on a scale he had never imagined. When my uncle Alessandro mentioned that our family's shipping routes had been established, back when Marco Polo was still traveling, Marco's face went pale as he realized the timeline implied centuries of established power, not the recent success I had described. "How long?" he whispered to me during a lull in conversation, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "How long has your family been... this?" The question encompassed everything: the wealth, the influence, the casual mentions of historical significance that peppered every conversation. I squeezed his hand, trying to convey reassurance through touch since words seemed inadequate. "A long time," I admitted quietly. "Longer than I let you believe. But Marco, that doesn't change anything about us, about what we mean to each other." Even as I said it, I could see in his eyes that everything had already changed, that the woman he thought he was marrying had been replaced by someone whose very existence challenged every assumption he had made about our relationship. The man I loved was looking at me like a stranger, and I had no one to blame but myself for putting us in this impossible situation. The toast portion of the evening began with the usual parade of heartfelt speeches from friends and family. But I could sense Benedetta growing more agitated with each passing minute. She fidgeted with her wine glass, adjusted her jewelry nervously, and kept glancing at her watch as if operating on some internal countdown. When Giuseppe rose to give his toast, stumbling through a sweet, if rambling speech about love and family acceptance, I saw her eyes flash with impatience. This wasn't what she had planned, and she was clearly struggling with whether to proceed with whatever scheme she had devised or abort in the face of the evening's unexpected developments. The decision was made for her when my mother stood to speak, her presence immediately commanding the attention of every person in the room. Caterina Rossi could have read the phone book and made it sound like poetry, but her wedding toast was a masterpiece of diplomatic grace and subtle warning. She spoke about the strength that comes from family traditions, the importance of respecting those who came before us, and the responsibility that accompanies inherited privilege. Every word was carefully chosen, every phrase designed to educate as much as celebrate. By the time she finished, even the most obtuse guest understood that they were in the presence of true aristocracy, not the American pretenders Benedetta had been describing all evening. The applause was thunderous and sustained, but I could see Benedetta's face darkening with the realization that her narrative was crumbling around her. The moment of truth arrived when Benedetta finally rose to give her toast, her face flushed with wine and determination. The room fell silent with the expectant hush that always accompanies parental speeches, but I could sense the undercurrents of tension rippling through the European guests who had witnessed her earlier behavior. She raised her glass with theatrical flourish, her smile bright enough to power the entire vineyard, and began what sounded like a traditional Italian blessing. "To my son Marco and his beautiful bride," she began in English, her accent thick with manufactured emotion. "Today we celebrate not just their love, but the joining of two families, two traditions, two ways of understanding what it means to be Italian." The opening was conventional enough, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes as she prepared to switch tactics. What happened next would have been devastating if her target had been someone without the resources to fight back. But Benedetta had miscalculated catastrophically. She thought she was exposing a fraud, but she was about to discover that the fraud was her own understanding of who wielded real power in this room. As she transitioned into Italian, beginning what she clearly believed would be the coup de grace of her campaign against my family's legitimacy, I felt the familiar cold calm of a Rossi woman preparing for war. The patience was over, the mercy had been exhausted, and the time for consequences had finally arrived. Benedetta was about to learn why my family had survived and thrived for centuries, and why crossing us was a mistake from which there was no recovery. Ma ora devo dire la verità, Benedetta continued in Italian, her voice gaining strength as she believed herself safe behind the language barrier. But now I must tell the truth. This girl and her family, they think they can buy respect with their American dollars. They wave their money around like it makes them real Italians. But we know better. We know what real Italian heritage looks like, what real traditions mean. The words hit the room like a physical slap, and I watched the faces of my European guests transform from polite attention to shocked outrage. My cousin Lorenzo's wife grabbed his arm so hard I could see her knuckles turn white, while my godmother's expression shifted from diplomatic neutrality to barely controlled fury. But Benedetta was just getting started, emboldened by what she perceived as her audience's attention. I pray that my son will wake up before it's too late, before this American pretender fills his children's heads with her false stories and bought traditions. Better he should be alone than tied to someone who doesn't understand what it means to truly belong to our culture. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft clink of glasses as some guests attempted to process what they had just heard. Marco looked like he had been struck by lightning, his face cycling through confusion, horror, and dawning understanding of what his mother had just said about the woman he loved. This was the moment I had been building toward, the confrontation I had orchestrated but hoped would never be necessary. But Benedetta had made her choice, had revealed her true character in front of everyone who mattered, and now it was time for her to face the consequences of her words. As I rose from my chair, feeling the weight of centuries of Rossi dignity settling around my shoulders like armor, I knew that what happened next would define not just our marriage, but the entire future of both our families. The transformation in the room was immediate and electric as I stood and began to speak in Italian so fluent, so perfectly accented, so unmistakably aristocratic that it sent shockwaves through every guest who understood the language. Signora Benedetti, I began, my voice carrying the authority that had been bred into me since childhood. Permettimi di ringraziarti per aver mostrato a tutti I presenti il tuo vero carattere. Allow me to thank you for showing everyone present your true character. The effect was immediate and devastating. Benedetta's face drained of color as she realized that her linguistic fortress had not only been breached, but completely destroyed. But I was far from finished, and the reckoning that followed would be remembered long after the last guest had gone home. The time for patience had ended, the moment for mercy had passed, and the woman who had spent months insulting my family was about to discover exactly who she had been fighting all along. Marco stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, caught between admiration and something that looked disturbingly like fear, as his wife revealed depths he had never suspected existed. The real Valentina Rossi was finally stepping out of the shadows, and the world would never look quite the same again. The words that followed my linguistic revelation cut through the vineyard air like a blade forged from centuries of aristocratic steel. For 8 months, I continued in Italian, my voice carrying clearly across the silent terrace. I have listened to every insult you believed was safely hidden behind language. Every slur against my character, every curse upon my marriage, every poisonous word spoken in the belief that your ignorance was protection. The crowd was transfixed, even those who didn't speak Italian sensing the magnitude of what was unfolding before them. Benedetta tried to interrupt, to somehow salvage control of a situation spiraling beyond her comprehension. But I silenced her with a raised hand that carried the authority of generations. This was my moment, my reckoning, and I would not be denied the satisfaction of complete truth. What happened next would strip away every illusion, every pretense, every comfortable lie that had allowed this woman to terrorize me with impunity. The time for half measures was over. The moment for total victory had arrived. Marco sat frozen beside me, his eyes wide with shock as he realized that the woman he married possessed depths of power and fury he had never imagined possible. The gentle, accommodating daughter-in-law was gone, replaced by someone who commanded respect through birthright rather than marriage, through heritage rather than wealth, through blood rather than circumstance. "You called my family American pretenders," I said, switching to English so that every guest could understand the full scope of her ignorance. "You prayed for my marriage to fail, cursed my unborn children, and declared that your son deserved better than trash from a family of nobodies." The gasps from the English-speaking guests were audible now, as they finally understood what had really transpired during that seemingly beautiful Italian toast. Several of Marco's friends looked horrified, while others stared in disbelief at this revelation of hidden cruelty. Giuseppe appeared to be aging in real time, his face gray with the dawning realization of what his wife had done to their family's reputation. But it was Marco's expression that broke my heart. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in slow motion, caught between loyalty to his mother and horror at her actions. The woman who had raised him, who had taught him about love and family and tradition, had just been revealed as someone capable of breathtaking cruelty toward the person he loved most. I could see him struggling to reconcile these two versions of his mother, trying to find some way to make sense of the cognitive dissonance that was tearing his heart apart. But there was no reconciliation possible, no middle ground that could accommodate both love for his mother and respect for his wife. Benedetta had forced this choice upon him with her own words, her own actions, her own refusal to accept that her son's happiness mattered more than her prejudices. The moment of ultimate revelation arrived as I gestured toward my family members scattered throughout the crowd, each one a piece of evidence in the case I was building against Benedetta's credibility. "But you made one crucial error in your assessment," I said, my voice taking on the cold precision that had made my mother legendary in boardroom negotiations. "When you dismissed my family as nobodies, you insulted one of the oldest noble houses in Italy." The recognition hit several guests immediately, but I wasn't finished dismantling her world. Lorenzo Rossi, CEO of Rossi Maritime International, the shipping empire you see advertised in every major port from Genoa to Hong Kong. Lorenzo inclined his head graciously, every inch the Roman aristocrat he had been born to be. Alessandro Rossi, whose vineyards have been producing wine for the papal table for 4 centuries. My uncle raised his glass in acknowledgement, his dignity intact despite the circus surrounding him. And my godmother, Sofia di Montecroce, whose family name appears in the history books you apparently never read. Sophia's smile was serene but pointed, the expression of someone who had just watched ignorance expose itself with spectacular thoroughness. With each introduction, I watched Benedetta's face grow paler as she began to understand the magnitude of her miscalculation. These weren't just wealthy relatives. They were the living embodiment of everything she had claimed to represent, everything she had accused my family of lacking. The final blow came when I addressed the heart of her accusations directly, my voice carrying across the vineyard with the authority of absolute truth. "You spoke of authentic Italian heritage, of real traditions, of what it means to truly belong to our culture. Let me educate you, since your understanding appears incomplete." The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep while maintaining the appearance of civility. The Rossi family has been documented in Italian records since 1347. We survived the Black Death, the wars of Italian unification, 2 world wars, and countless political upheavals because we understood something you apparently never learned, that true nobility comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. The historical weight behind those words was crushing, reducing Benedetta's claims of authenticity to the desperate grasping of someone whose own family had fled poverty less than a century ago. But more than that, it exposed the fundamental difference between inherited grace and acquired pretension, between confidence and insecurity, between genuine power and its desperate imitation. The woman who had spent months lecturing me about Italian values had just been schooled by someone whose family had been defining those values when hers was still struggling to survive in the hills of Sicily. The reversal was complete, total, and utterly devastating. Marco's reaction to these revelations was the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire evening. As the scope of my family's influence became clear, I watched him retreat further into himself, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was learning. When my mother casually mentioned that our vineyard in Tuscany employed over 300 people, his face went ashen with the realization that my hobby was larger than his entire family's livelihood. When my uncle referenced business dealings with the Vatican, Marco looked like he might be sick. The man I loved was drowning in the enormity of what I had hidden from him, and every new detail felt like another weight pulling him deeper underwater. "Why?" he whispered to me during a lull in the revelations, his voice barely audible above the murmurs of the crowd. "Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth?" The question cut deeper than any of his mother's insults, because it went to the heart of everything I had been trying to protect. How do you explain that you lied out of love? How do you justify deception in the name of authenticity? How do you convince someone that your half-truths were meant to preserve something pure rather than exploit something naive? The answers felt inadequate even in my own mind, and I could see in his eyes that they felt like betrayal regardless of my intentions. The woman who had started this evening as his beloved bride was ending it as someone he wasn't sure he knew at all. And that transformation was entirely my own doing. The aftermath of my revelations rippled through the reception like aftershocks from an earthquake, fundamentally altering the social landscape of the evening. Benedetta sat in stunned silence, abandoned by friends who had suddenly remembered pressing engagements elsewhere, while Giuseppe struggled to process the magnitude of what his wife had done to their family's standing in the community. The Italian guests who had witnessed her earlier toast were no longer politely scandalized. They were actively outraged, their conversations undoubtedly planning ways to ensure that word of this evening reached the appropriate circles in Italy. My family members closed ranks around me with protective instincts honed by generations of navigating complex social and political situations. But their support felt hollow when the person whose opinion mattered most was looking at me like a stranger. Marco's American friends approached with a mixture of awe and confusion, unsure how to process the revelation that their buddy had married into what amounted to Italian royalty. The photographer continued to document everything, capturing images that would tell the story of this evening for decades to come. The moment when a family's true power was revealed, when prejudice met its match, when justice was served with the precision of a master chef. But underneath all the drama and satisfaction of watching Benedetta's world crumble, I felt a growing emptiness where my happiness should have been. I had won the war, but I was no longer certain I still had a marriage worth fighting for. As the evening wound toward its conclusion, the final scene played out with a poetic justice that would have been satisfying if it hadn't come at such a personal cost. Benedetta made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her reputation, approaching Marco with tears streaming down her face and panic written in every line of her body. "Marco, figlio mio," she pleaded in broken Italian mixed with English. "I was trying to protect you. I didn't know. I couldn't have known." But the time for ignorance as an excuse had passed, and her son's response was swift and final. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice heavy with a sadness that seemed to age him before our eyes. "You didn't try to protect me. You tried to destroy the woman I love because you were afraid of losing control. That's not love. That's selfishness." The judgment was delivered without anger, but with a finality that was somehow more devastating than rage would have been. As Marco took my hand and led me away from the destruction his mother had created, I should have felt triumph, vindication, the sweet satisfaction of justice served. Instead, I felt the weight of everything that had been lost in the process. The trust, the innocence, the simple joy of two people in love building a life together. We had survived Benedetta's assault on our marriage, but I wasn't sure we had survived my defense of it. The Rossi family had achieved another victory, but the cost of that victory was still being calculated. As we drove away from the vineyard toward our honeymoon suite, Marco's silence filled the car like a living thing, and I realized that some battles, even when won decisively, leave scars that never fully heal. The war was over, but the real work of rebuilding what we had lost was just beginning. So, what did you think of this epic revenge? For those of you who made it this far and followed this entire story, leave a comment telling me what you would do in Valentina's place. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take advantage now. It's just a click for you. But for us, it's the fuel that keeps these incredible stories coming to you. And look, there's another video waiting for you. An even more shocking story that will leave you speechless. Click here and I'll be waiting for you there.